This is the Cloud Security Today podcast, where leaders learn how to get cloud security done. And now your host, Matt Chiodi.
In this month's episode, we feature Chris Hughes, who is the CISO and co-founder of Aquia, which is helping federal civilian organizations and the Department of Defense achieve secure digital transformations. Now, before you think, I'm not in federal, this won't have any applicability to me, I'd encourage you to listen, because the concepts that Chris talks about with DevSecOps, talking about software factories, are 100% applicable to all spaces. And so I think you should listen deeply, take notes, as I always say, and get ready to learn about how to build security in the cloud at scale using automation and compliance. Thank you for joining us today. And we have an awesome guest with Chris Hughes joining us. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
So let's just jump right into it. And I want to start out by asking, I like to stalk all my guests on LinkedIn, right? Been following you a long time, but according to LinkedIn, you have 28 licenses and certifications. And these range from Security Plus to an AWS Solutions Architect Professional. Couple questions, right? What drove you to get all of these, and how have you used them practically in work?
Yeah, it's definitely a few factors at play. One is I've just been in the career field for quite a while, like over 15 years. So I've accumulated them over the years. And then two is, like, for me, when it comes to learning, I tend to do better when I have like a defined goal and something to work towards, like maybe a test deadline or, exam kind of registered, puts the pressure on me to really buckle down and study and learn something. And just always wanted to be continuing to grow in our career field. Like things, as things change. When I got Security Plus, AWS wasn't even a thing, right? So things in the career field changed quite a bit. So I'm always trying to just keep learning, stay on top of that, and just keep the pressure on myself to keep growing. That said, though, I love your comment about have you practically used them, because you can go overboard and start studying and get certifications for things that you're not even using in your day-to-day job. You likely may never encounter, and it can be an intimidating thing for someone looking at, oh, he has 28 certifications. I'll never have that many. You don't need that many, right? You just need to know what you need to know for your job and where organizations you're working with are headed for, in my opinion.
So where do you, I'm going to ask, this is not part of our script, but let's, where do you stand on the whole certification debate? Obviously you have 28 of them, so you see value in them, but there's, I think I posted something on LinkedIn a while ago, and I'm always surprised by what catches fire. I screenshotted my notification from ISC Squared saying, hey, we've suspended your CISSP. And it was like the most viewed thing I've ever posted on LinkedIn. And there was just debate like, it's not worth it. It's worth it. Where do you stand, especially like maybe if somebody's early on in their career, like would you tell them to get them? Like where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think it's I kind of hate how we like argue everything in black and white, like our binary in our career field and in society in general. For sure we're so polarized. Like it's like compliance versus security or certifications versus experience. Like it could be both, right? Someone could have a lot of experience and some certifications along the way. So I don't discourage people getting certifications. I think it's a great way to like have a structured learning path or endeavor towards learning a certain topic or technology. I definitely encourage it, especially if you're new to the career field. But like folks like you or I who have been around a long time, you likely don't have as much of a need for certifications if you have a lot of experience under your belt, but so I don't like fall on one side or the other. I don't think certifications are inherently bad, but I do think, only focusing on certifications with no experience, relevant experience to back it up, is definitely not a good thing either. So I don't think it's bad or good. It's just part of the career field and one method of learning.
I love that. It's funny. You bring back a memory when I was in college. I won't say when. People can look at my LinkedIn profile, but back when I was in college, I went out and I got a couple of the Microsoft certifications, and I had no experience, right? Other than playing around with, I won't even say what operating system it was, but a Microsoft operating system that won't be named. And I remember thinking, yeah, that kind of got some of the technical concepts down, but I've never actually done anything like really with this. So yeah, I hear you. It's like, it kind of helps, but still need the experience.
It's a catch-22, to be honest with you, too. Like, when I started learning AWS, I hadn't really got a chance to work with AWS quite yet, but I wanted to. I wanted to work in cloud. I wanted to be a cloud security professional. So I started learning as much as I could about AWS and getting certified in AWS. And then, as it became, like I got an opportunity to work with cloud because people say, oh, he's been learning this. He's been, immersing himself in this and really eager to learn this. So I got an opportunity to get hands-on experience. So it can, sometimes it can be a way to get your foot in the door as well.
So let's back up for a minute. You started your career in cybersecurity, it looks like back in 2008 when you were in the U.S. Air Force. Talk about how that experience shaped then the next 10 years or so, or maybe even more up until your time at Aquia, which
yeah, definitely.
We'll ask you about Aquia in a minute.
Yeah. It definitely played a critical part, going into the Air Force. I had a background in technology. I had worked with technology at a couple of companies prior, and I always played with computers as a kid, but I didn't know much about cybersecurity or how great of a career fit or great of an opportunity it would be for me, to be honest with you. But then when I went into the Air Force, I learned a ton, working, I started at the help desk and worked all the way from, that to system administration to, network admin to, here we are with cloud and CISO and things like that. So it was a great opportunity to get my foot in the door of the career field and learn like how technology and how cybersecurity works in large enterprises, highly regulated environments. And it kind of set the trajectory for my career. Here I am all these years later, and I've kind of stuck around the public sector, just because I am passionate about the mission. When you talk about the Department of Defense or you talk about the federal government providing, civil services and critical, things to society, that's always kept me around this space, to be honest with you.
I love that. So now you co-founded a company that goes by the name Aquia about a year ago, roughly. Tell us about, what you do there, what's the mission, and what problems are you solving?
Yeah, definitely. As I said, I started in the Air Force, and then I had a couple government jobs actually with Navy and the FedRAMP team, those familiar with FedRAMP, and worked on the industry side at a couple other companies. And then I started asking myself, why don't I try to do this myself when it comes to cybersecurity? And I saw things that went well and things that didn't go well from a company's perspective and how they did things. And, I had an opportunity to team up with a couple of partners and bring, what we feel is a different brand of cybersecurity, technical rigor and expertise to the public sector, for example. We've kind of blended the best of commercial talent that we've brought, people from the commercial side of things and meshed that with people who have deep expertise in the federal domain, when it comes to compliance and cybersecurity and some of the nuance that, comes with working with the government. And we've really been focusing on transformational type efforts, things such as cloud, cloud security, DevSecOps, application security and threat modeling. You've seen me share quite a bit around zero trust is another area we've been focusing on. So we really have a bias for that transformational type work that's really going to, change the status quo in the way the government operates technology and cybersecurity.
If you had to, and this again, I know I didn't ask you this beforehand, but I'm just curious, if you kind of had to, if using a baseball analogy, I don't know if you're a baseball fan or not, but, where, generally speaking, if you look at where DoD is today with the use of cloud versus, let's say, civilian part of the federal space, and where are they in the analogy in terms of innings? Do you say like DoD versus, is one ahead of the other? Are they about in the same place? What's that look like?
So it's hard to say because it is such a diverse, it's a massive, ecosystem of different agencies, right?
Sure.
You can take one agency versus another on the federal civilian side, and they can be drastically different in terms of their cloud maturity or cloud security maturity. And then like even the DoD, you have some, definitely some laggards and massive, legacy footprints, but you also have programs like, Platform One and Kessel Run and the Space Force who are trying to do some really innovative things when it comes to cloud. So I'd be reluctant to kind of put one inning on the entire Department of Defense or one inning,
Sure.
But I will say there are some entities that are doing really innovative things, even for the commercial space, when you compare to some of the stuff coming out of places like Platform One. On the civilian side, look at programs like BatCave at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. They're doing really innovative work that's on par with many large commercial organizations from what I've seen.
What are they doing? I'm not familiar with BatCave, but I love the name. So, I mean, I want to know more about it immediately.
Yeah. If you're in government, you got to bring a cool name to jazz it up and make it exciting. But, you've likely heard the term software factory, and so BatCave, much like, Platform One and Kessel Run, is a software factory in the federal government space. And what they're doing is they're building a platform as a service, think of a Kubernetes containerized, orchestration type environment, building on top of cloud, utilizing infrastructure as code, immutable containers, and building robust, CI/CD security pipelines, SaaS, DAS, secret scanning, SBOM, things like that, and bringing that kind of way of delivering software to the agency or Department of Defense in the DoD's case. So it's a really innovative way of doing things, and it can streamline a lot of the traditional, security controls that you have to meet if you're an individual system owner. If I can work in like a platform as a service type environment that's already authorized, I can inherit a lot of controls from the cloud provider, from the organizational level, from the platform level, and ultimately focus on my app and delivering value to my stakeholders, my constituents.
So back in February, you created a GitHub repo for federal DoD compliance innovation. I think that's what you called it. And I'll put a link to this in the show notes. First, not everybody in our audience is federal specific. They're not focused on public sector. So tell us what that means and then how it relates to cloud and maybe what your vision is for how it might be used in the future.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess to give some context, anyone that has worked in the federal domain, when it comes to compliance can attest that it's often one of the most, if not the most, tedious, burdensome processes of getting software and systems into production in a production environment, going through what they call the risk management framework, the ATO, authority to operate process. It's usually this 3-year cyclical, massive, process you have to go through, meet all these controls from NIST 800, publications, hundreds and thousands of sub controls, document all those in traditional paper-based compliance document formats. It could be a really heavy and burdensome process. So I created that repo because there are innovators, like I said, on the DoD and the federal side who are doing, a newer way of doing things, looking at efforts like OSCAL, which is kind of compliance and documentation as code that's being pushed by groups like GSA and FedRAMP and CMS and DoD now as well. Taking traditional, RMF or cybersecurity compliance documentation and putting it in machine readable formats so that you can, bring it closer to the kind of the DevOps way of working, everything as code type model. And that's a big part of it. And then building on some of the concepts I talked about earlier, like inheriting security controls, building these shared development platforms where people can go in and just, work on their application and inherit controls from the infrastructure and the platform layer when you think of like cloud deployment models. And then also, building those robust security pipelines is another aspect of it because you can facilitate security automation in that sense. So if I want to deliver, software to production, I don't have to go through this big, massive, paperwork process. I can simply push it through a pipeline that has defined, risk thresholds and security criteria, via the security tooling and push it right into production and have a level of assurance around the risk I've introduced, to a production environment versus traditional, 3-year massive, massive burdensome process. You've likely heard the term continuous ATO going around. This is kind of built around that way of thinking.
Okay. So, and while we're on that point, you brought up the continuous ATO, right? So again, for those that if you're not in the federal space, this is something very having to do specifically with federal, but I think there are parallels definitely in the commercial space. So don't tune out. So this is one of the most discussed subjects in kind of probably all of federal right now, that continuous ATO or the CATO. So, first and foremost, this obviously is a cloud podcast, but based upon your experience, how do agencies go about achieving continuous ATO in the cloud? Is there a roadmap you recommend? What have you seen work best, not work well? And tell us a story. What have you seen?
Yeah, so definitely, to start it off with, historically, there hasn't necessarily been one defined way of doing it. Kind of organically, organizations have done it themselves. Places like Kessel Run and Platform One and others have done it organically themselves. Army Cloud, if you look at the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency and Army, for example, another entity pursuing this, they've done it organically. But that said, DoD CIO's office, the Chief Information Officer's office, just recently released a CATO memo that laid out, 3 criteria when it comes to pursuing a CATO, which, it revolved around things like continuous monitoring of the environment, getting that real-time compliance monitoring. You talk about parallels to the commercial space. I know you work at Palo Alto, massive cloud involvement, right? When you look at native services from the cloud providers, things such as Azure Security Center or AWS, Security Hub or AWS Audit Manager, getting that near real-time telemetry when it comes to security controls. This is applicable, look at something like a SOC 2 or another, kind of a commercial compliance framework. Even then, it was like a snapshot in time. You come in, you assess something, you come back again, you assess it again several months later. That's not really giving you real-time assurance of, your compliance hygiene or your compliance adherence. So leaning into those native cloud services is a key aspect of that. And then another aspect of things is, as what they call defense or cyber operations. So having visibility in your environment, watching for malicious activity from, malicious actors or nefarious actors, or even insider threats, keeping an eye on things and seeing, do we have malicious behavior occurring? from a cybersecurity perspective, and being able to respond to that in near real time is another critical aspect of achieving that continuous ATO. So those are some of the fundamental things in that traditionally wasn't done in a legacy ATO type framework, and that are now being pushed. Now that we've moved into like this native, cloud native DevSecOps type environments that we didn't have previously.
So this sounds like, although again, if somebody's not in federal and they're thinking continuous ATO, I don't know what that is, continuous authority to operate or authorization to operate. It sounds like it's the same thing as what we talk about in commercial in terms of continuous compliance. Same thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton of commercial, innovators that are starting up, startups around, SaaS-based startups, for example, that integrate with your multiple cloud service providers to try to give you that near real-time ongoing visibility of your compliance adherence. Whether you're talking, PCI or HIPAA or SOC 2 or whatever the framework, and in federal government space, RMF and NIST 800, for example, having that visibility in near real time, via the cloud integration and that ongoing monitoring that we didn't traditionally have. If even in the SOC 2, you may get a visit again in 6 months and say, yeah, they're operating the controls on a continuous basis. But the evaluation was coming, right? You're going to get ready to get audited. But it's a lot different when you're getting audited in near real time, in minute intervals, for example, versus like every so many months, for example.
So one of the things that I read about, and so it looks like we touched on this a little earlier. So the whole concept of a software factory. I saw that back in May of 21, the DoD Enterprise DevSecOps Strategy Guide. This appeared in there, and I'll pull a quote out. So this is a direct quote. It says, "quote To deliver resilient software capability at the speed of relevance, the department needs to implement strategies that focus on cybersecurity and survivability across the development process." It goes on to say the DoD CIO and the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense recognize the urgent need to rethink our software development practices and culture by leveraging the commercial sector for new approaches and best practices. So why don't you kind of break that down a little bit for us? What's the software factory? How are they created and operationalized? Let's just start there.
Yeah, it's definitely a nuanced, kind of specific term to the federal government. But that said, if you look to other industry groups like Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they even have a software factory, kind of reference architecture that's in draft, which is not, in particular specific to the government. So that's something to go check out. But in my opinion, I'm sure you get a lot of different opinions on this topic, but a software factory is kind of a standardized approach to how you, kind of collectively operate as a team and deliver software. In other words, how you deliver value to your stakeholders. I think that's the best way to put it, at a high level. And how they're created and operationalized is going to be different in every environment, but it's breaking down those silos, between your development, security, and operations teams, bringing a standardized way of operating when you think of like infrastructure as code, using GitOps type deployment models where you're, switching from, manually logging into things. Everything is kind of managed as code, configured as code, and deployed as code. And delivering in a standardized fashion is the best way I can put it. And I think you talked about how you get there, and it's going to look a little different for everyone, because this is something, it's the same thing like DevSecOps or Zero Trust. Like the journey is going to be unique to the organization. It's not going to be the same for everyone. But you ultimately know that you're working around fundamental methodologies, fundamental practices, and you're trying to, improve and expedite the way you deliver value for your respective organization or industry.
So it sounds like, the software factory, they're trying to kind of bring in some ideas around maybe industrial age type of things. If you think of a factory that produces a widget, right? And I remember using this analogy probably a long time ago with cloud. We were talking about the fact that, everybody talks about with cloud that, hey, it's great, you can scale things up. And I always like to say to people, like, that's true, but you have to be able to build the automation and the processes, just like you would have in a physical factory. So if you've got, let's say like a Tesla manufacturing plant or whatever it might be, they only have certain ability to crank production up and down. But the reason that they can do that is because they've standardized on processes and procedures and materials. So it sounds like they're trying to extend that concept into the world of software. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's definitely accurate. I actually just spoke at DevSecOps Days Pittsburgh for Carnegie Mellon this week, and I used an image that I got from the DevOps Institute. There's a lot of DevOps organizations and terms there, but it laid out the history of DevSecOps, and they did pull from lean manufacturing concepts like you just talked about. It kind of traces back to that that kind of a heritage, of how they try to pull these concepts into the software world and bringing a standardized way of doing things in the way you operate in your processes. And something I think that is important to call out, like you talked about the way that you can do things at scale when you have standardization or when you have, repeatable processes, infrastructure as code or cloud, for example, as you talked about. Palo Alto's Unit 42, for example, puts out a ton of great studies, as you know, because I see you sharing them like I do. When you look at their threat report they talked about the software supply chain, for example. If you look at infrastructure as code or container images, right, you can use those to scale quickly. But if you have a misconfiguration in there, you have vulnerable configurations or vulnerabilities baked into those, all you've done is scaled those out faster than you previously could have done, at a pace that you normally wouldn't have done. So it is important to have security and proper, rigor and governance baked into those processes, because otherwise you're just scaling your problems faster than you traditionally have.
Prisma Cloud secures infrastructure, applications, data, and entitlements across the world's largest clouds, all from a single unified solution. With a combination of cloud service provider APIs and a unified agent framework, users gain unmatched visibility and protection. Prisma Cloud also integrates with any continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow to secure cloud infrastructure and applications early in development. You can scan infrastructure as code templates, container images, serverless functions, and more while gaining powerful, full-stack runtime protection. This is unified security for DevOps and security teams. To find out more, go to prismacloud.io. I know you're a big fan of infrastructure as code, and obviously that's a key component of a software factory or any type of DevSecOps type of approach. But when it comes to security in the supply chain, it doesn't always guarantee success. And I think you mentioned a previous Palo Alto report where they actually went through some of those things and pointed out some of those numbers. But maybe tell us a story about how you've seen it go wrong, and then the other side of that would be what have you seen work to fix that? Yeah,
I mean, just using basic examples, looking at cloud, things like security groups or AMIs, like Amazon Machine Images, for example. I've seen those infrastructure as code templates deployed that are using vulnerable AMIs or AMIs that haven't been hardened or haven't had vulnerability scanning conducted against them and remediated, for example, or have overly permissive IAM access controls for users in the environment. I've seen that happen many times, and I think what I've seen organizations start to do about it is just like everything else is code. If you look at traditional code, you're using SAS and DAS and things like that. We're now seeing infrastructure as code and Kubernetes manifest scanning tools come into the ecosystem, starting to scan those things before you put them in a production environment and see what are the vulnerabilities in these infrastructure as code manifests or these Kubernetes manifests that we're getting ready to deploy, and catching that. You think about shift left security. The same concept applies when you think of infrastructure as code, is kind of catching those things earlier in the life cycle. And then obviously Palo Alto, if I'm not mistaken, acquired a group named Bridge Crew, right? Who's very big on compliance as code. So if you think about how you used to do security, you'd go around and try to get people to tidy up their permissions, their configurations, and align with some organizational policy or regulatory controls and things like that. Well, what if you can bake those into your infrastructure as code templates, knowing that you have certain restrictions around how we allow networking to happen, or how we allow access control and identity management to be done at our organization? If you can bake those things into your infrastructure as code earlier in the life cycle, you're saving a ton of time, ton of money, and you're actually catching them before they ever get to a runtime environment to be exploited by a malicious actor.
What examples do you have? I'm curious if you think through either, and obviously if you can't say the specific client name, that's totally understandable, but maybe as you've worked through this, either with Aquia, your company started in the last year or so, even in the last maybe number of years, give us a little bit of insight into what that actually looks like to stand up a software factory. Because I think this concept, whether someone's in commercial or whether they're on the federal side, I think they're the same concepts, right? I mean, obviously what they're shooting for in terms of compliance might look different, but I think the way to get there, I would guess, is likely some of those same things. So what have you seen?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's some differences in terms of regulatory requirements, different frameworks you may have to adhere to, if you're in the public sector versus private sector versus healthcare versus finance or whatever. But there are standardized technologies and processes that you're going to be orienting yourself around. Some of those are going to be fundamental things such as, what cloud or cloud environments will we be operating in? What kind of CI platforms will we be using? What's our infrastructure as code baseline going to be? Those are all fundamental things that people start to get in order as they start to build out these software factories? What teams will we have? What responsibilities will be among the teams? And how do we reduce silos? Because we always seen in the past, security has been kind of an afterthought or comes in after the fact and tries to tidy things up or propose a new way of doing things that's more secure. So breaking that down and building those cohesive, cross-functional teams is another fundamental aspect of building these software factories, whether you're in the public or private sector. So those are some fundamental things. It's just getting a standardized way of doing things. What are your teams going to look like? What clouds are you going to operate in? What is your CI platform going to look like? What are you going to put in your pipeline when it comes to, security tooling and automation? What kind of thresholds are you going to set? And what will we allow to go through the pipeline and be deployed versus what are we going to break a build or break a deployment on and go back and have the developer, kind of remediate something before it can go to production. And while those thresholds in terms of risk may look different depending on your organization or, if you're operating in the intelligence community versus, you're in the commercial space, your threshold for risk may look different. But, ultimately, those fundamental concepts are going to be the same.
I get this question a lot. And it's that, we want to do DevSecOps. I want to get the tools. I want to do the software factory component. But I'm struggling with the people side of it. The people are the hardest. I can't tell you how many calls I've done around this, trying to help people work through this. In terms of getting this through organizationally, right? Really getting the buy-in. What have you seen work on the people side, right? Obviously, they can go out and get tools. Like there's 100 different vendors that make tools around this. And I always tell people that's like the easy part, like building the business case to buy a tool. But getting those people to use the tool, like what about the people side of it?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on, in my opinion, like the biggest problem, and it's being validated by people asking that question. If you look at, security spend, for example, we spend roughly 3% of our security spend on people related stuff. And yet 85% of security incidents involve a human factor, right? So we disproportionately spend on technology. And I've seen it happen many, many times. I actually have more, I hate to say it, but I have more horror stories than success stories when it comes to this, because I think it's so pervasive across all industries and all organizations. But people have a plan to move to the cloud or a plan to implement DevSecOps, and they get so wound up on focusing on the cloud platform or your CI/CD tool chain, what tools we're going to use, what technologies we're going to use to tackle this. Same thing with Zero Trust, and they forget. Like we have a workforce, we have a culture at play here. How do we upskill the workforce? How do we prepare them to use these new technologies? How do we change the way we operate as a team and teams within our organization to facilitate the goals that we're trying to achieve? And I think it's so often that, that's just often overlooked. We think we can just buy our way out of things. Like all we got to do is get a pipeline or we get in the cloud and we're good to go. And it's like, no, like you still have people that are making decisions. These people are deciding the tools, they're configuring the tools, they're getting the tools to integrate and communicate and work together, and they're working together as teams. So it's like the people aspect is so overlooked, and it's really harming our, pursuit of digital transformation. It's a bit ironic, right? Because, digital transformation sounds super technology centric, but ultimately it comes back to your people.
It's changing your processes, right? I mean, The process is such a big part of it. I think it was on LinkedIn fairly recently. I was dialoguing with somebody and I'm like, and they asked me for the answer to a similar question. And I said, it's the same answer as always. It's people, process, and technology in that order. And unfortunately, as security professionals, we love to jump right to technology. We love to go buy the shiny toy. And it's like, yes, you need that shiny toy. But if you're not going to also address the people and the process side, which is unfortunately the hardest side in my view, that tool is probably not going to give you a good return on investment.
Yeah, it's 100% right. And it's ironic you said that because like my first slide for the presentation I talked about earlier this week said people, process, technology in that order. So I agree with you 100%. And like it is so true because we think we can just buy a technology and it will fix everything. And it's just simply not the case. And then like a lot of what I've seen on the federal side is like they have these ambitions to move to a software factory or move to DevSecOps, but they don't change their processes. They want to use these two new technologies in the same way they operated legacy technologies. And that causes a lot of friction and tension and ultimately, hard lessons learned, to be honest, in many cases.
So let's switch gears a little bit. So I've followed you for a while on LinkedIn. You are a prolific poster. I think you and I've talked about this through direct messages that you generate a lot of engagement. So first of all, I appreciate watching you because I've learned a lot from you and you've actually shared a lot with me too around kind of how you do it. So I hear this question a lot. Usually it's coming from somebody who's like, hey, I'm looking for a job. I've heard that, I've got to do everything on LinkedIn. Otherwise I'm not going to get a job anywhere else. So here's my question. What have you found an effective way to kind of build a following on LinkedIn, but also what do you think is an effective way to build a community?
Yeah, I think, honestly, it comes down to being authentic, and like me and you talked a little bit before we went on air, and you talked about how people appreciate, authenticity. And I found that that's really true. When you go back to the certification thing, for example, I've shared, passing certifications, but I've also failed, shared failing certifications. And I think those kind of things, like just being real and transparent with people, resonates with people. And then as far as building a community, like not just being authentic, but being consistent. A lot of people think like I have to have everything perfect before I make a post, or I got, just go, man, just do it. Like you'll learn as you go. You'll post something that'll be a total flop, and you'll post something else that'll be great, and that's just part of the process. And also look to other people that are doing it. Like I have a great following on there, and I've been lucky to have that, but it's just been like 3 or 4 years of being consistent. Like every day or almost every day, I'm trying to share something that I'm learning, as I'm reading, as I'm, tinkering with things. I'm trying to share that with the community. And then, as my following has grown, ironically enough, I've learned more and more from them, because I have more and more stuff popping up in my feed of other like-minded individuals that are sharing things, but go look at people like, yourself. There's people like AJ Yawn, Mike Miller, Jarek Beeson. These folks are out there just, every day just sharing open dialogue around, things in our community and in our industry of cybersecurity, the good and the bad. And they're just being really transparent about that, and just, being open and having normal conversations, I think can be really powerful. And it just resonates with people in this world of social media where we're so used to seeing, the highlight reel and everything is perfect, and just be real. And I think that's the best, do that and be consistent and show that you're actually passionate about helping people. And it can go so far.
I love that. So it's consistent authenticity. Sounds like it's your formula.
Yeah, I think that's it. And you learn as you go. Like I said, you're not getting everything right. Sometimes I'll realize like, I could have said something better, or I could have shared something in a more informative way. But just continue to iterate on that and continue to show up is really the most powerful thing you can do.
I've also found that no matter how hard I try, I have not been able to game the LinkedIn algorithm yet. So sometimes I will, like you said, I'll take time, I'll craft something like, okay, this is going to be great. And it's just like nobody pays attention to it. And I'm like, what happened? And then I'll post something that I literally spent like, I'm sitting on a plane, and it's got I've got 5 minutes for takeoff, and I see something that I'm like, this is really interesting, and I have a thought on this, and I just quick tap it out. I hit send. By the time I land, the thing is like blown up, and I just, you know what I mean? It's like you said, it's like the most authentic you can be, almost off the top of your head, not thought out. It seems like that's the stuff that people really want to engage with.
Yeah, 100%. Like, there's a method to the madness in terms of like what time of the day you post, or sharing versus posting something original and those kind of things. But like really like the hot takes and just like, the off the cuff, open thoughts is what really resonates. Like you said, I've had things where I really crafted. I'm like, oh, people are going to love this. And I share it like nothing. And then like other things, I just, go on like a little rant or something about something, and you just throw it up there. And like next thing you know, like it really started a ton of great discussion and great debate about a topic. So yeah, just like that authenticity is really, really what resonates, I think.
I know you're a big fan of reading physical books, and so am I. And when I say physical books, so I know there's some people who probably don't even know what that is anymore, but actual paper book, not something on Kindle, not reading it on screen, not even listening. So what's your reason behind reading physical books on paper?
So it's a couple of things. Like one is we stare at a screen like all damn day. And sometimes I just don't want to be looking at a screen, and I want to like hold something and touch it. Right. And then also like I have 4 young kids. I have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and like a 10-month-old. And I've started to notice like I was a big person. Like, oh, I got everything in my O'Reilly library and just put it up on my phone or my tablet or whatever, wherever I want, whenever I want. And I realized like, wait, they're seeing me all the time, like staring at a screen and not seeming like, I'm engaged. And the same can be said obviously from reading a book, but it's just a little different. I think it shows them that you're actually into reading. They don't really comprehend at a young age that, oh, he's reading a book. They think that you're just on an electronic device, and they start to try to emulate that. And I found that like I started reading physical books and collecting them, and then I can share them or give them to someone else when I finish them, something else I like to do. And I've noticed like, my 8-year-old, for example, like now she's starting to carry around a book, or I'll find her like she's supposed to be in bed and she's like in the hallway reading a book, with a light. And I'm like, I want to yell at her to go to bed, but at the same time, I'm like, well, she's actually doing something pretty good. So, it puts me in a tough spot. But I just think it's, feeling something physical, having something in your hand after staring at a screen all day, and just trying to show my kids like it's good to read. And I think that resonates better with them, with a physical book versus like an electronic device.
I read a study a while ago, and I'd have to see the follow-up to see if they've got additional data on it. But it actually showed that the way that you absorb material from something that is physically in your hand because of the tactile response, you actually remember it longer. So that's like one of my main reasons. But also, I agree with you. I have two kids. They're older now, but when they were younger, I remember my son. He was like, "You're always staring at your phone," and I was like, "Well, I'm not." Where he said, "You're always working," and I'm like, "I'm not actually working. I'm actually reading like something leisurely that I enjoy." So for that one conversation that he had with me actually caused me to really like focus on physical paper books, just so the kids could say, "Oh yeah, Dad isn't working all the time. He's reading something. Oh, what is that book?" Right? It's like you have, kids just, I think, assume that you're playing on your phone, Candy Crush or whatever it might be, or you're working. So I agree with you on that one.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, so a lot of reading, obviously that's the way that you grow. But in terms of your personal growth, what's the formula? What works for you?
Honestly, like I talked about, setting kind of goals, whether it's an exam or something to aim towards, is a big thing. And then just, being persistent, like same thing with the LinkedIn thing, is just like staying persistent with my learning. Cause like, a lot of people will think like, oh, you're so, you're so smart, or you know all these things. And like, they think it's just inherent. Really, it's just like being diligent and being committed to learning and always staying on top of that. And, just being committed to the process and understanding like it's a journey. You're never going to know everything. But also knowing that you want to be your best, whether it's for your family or for your organization or for yourself, just like trying to push yourself to a higher standard is the way I look at it. And, I'm always trying to show up and be a little bit better than I was the day before. And if that means, even reading a few pages or something like that, having a conversation with someone that I can learn from, or I can, give some information to that benefits them. That's kind of my strategy, is just like always wanting to be a little bit better than I was the day before, and just, kind of diligently working at that.
Do you have a process that you follow for setting goals, or what does that look like for you?
Typically I have done like the whole, like, it's a new year, I'm going to set, these, I want to get, X, Y, and Z, and like that kind of stuff. But like, it could be a good thing and a bad thing. Like you can become a taskmaster and you can burn yourself out in that way, like, and then you set like unrealistic goals, like that you can't, hold yourself to over a 12-month period. So I just try to break it down, like, like in much smaller increments, and just like, say for the next 3 months, like for me personally right now, I've been focusing a lot on software supply chain, so for the next 3 months, like, most of what I read or take in or, digest is going to be around software supply chain. I just really want to learn more about that topic. And you'll be surprised, like even like, 10, 15 minutes a day of just immersing yourself in a certain topic after a few months, like you could be surprised like how much you can truly learn just from that little change in your daily habit.
Well, Chris, I've loved having you on. It's been a really great, far-ranging kind of conversation. Are there any parting words that you would have for our listeners, or maybe perhaps something you wanted to share that I didn't ask you about?
No, I think we touched on a lot of great things. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to come on, and I appreciate what you're doing for the community, and also, what your organization does and the research that they put out for people like me and others to keep learning. And that's all I'd say is, I love the community that we have in cybersecurity, and I'm really thankful to engage with everyone and look forward to continue to do so.
Awesome. Well, I loved having you on, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. To find out more, please visit us at cloudsecuritytoday.com.